Please welcome Adam.
Cool. Thanks, Kay. Cool. Let's get started. Has it stopped working? Still going. Agile, right? I have to say, there's a little bit of imposter syndrome happening to me right now because I'm standing here at an Agile conference. I don't really think of myself as an Agile guy. I'm very much more of a test guy, albeit one who's very much kind of into Agile and I think appreciative of the influence that it's had on my life and my career, I guess. I jumped from of proper old school government flavored waterfall testing into nice sort of whizzy trade me shaped Agile testing. That's kind of had a huge influence on the way that I think about testing and the way that I think about software development, and taken me to some interesting places. So I don't need to, hopefully, you're all here at an Agile conference, and I think most of you have probably drank at least a little bit of the Kool-Aid already in terms of Agile software development in general. So I'm not going to talk too much about the benefits of that. But I think that as a test guy in the Agile world, I can't help but feel like testing is letting the side down a little bit in terms of we haven't really, as the royal we of testing, changed or adapted to the Agile world probably as well as maybe some of the other disciplines have done. At least, I guess that's my opinion. I think we can do a lot better than that. And what I'm going to hopefully talk about today is my feeling on how we can do a better job of doing testing in Agile, what I'm trying to do with my team at TradeMe, and hopefully that might be interesting and inspiring to some of you. So most testers in Agile teams, at least in my experience, the ones that I've talked to, or the people I've talked with who work with testers in Agile teams, it kind of leads me to think that broadly people who are doing testing in Agile fall into one of two main camps at the moment. The first camp, they kind of have their head in the sand a little bit. That sounds a little bit mean, but there's kind of all of this exciting innovation happening around them, this Agile evolution. Maybe it is happening, maybe it has happened. But for them, not a huge amount has really changed. I talk to a lot of testers who work in Agile teams who are still kind of doing the same thing fundamentally that they were before. They're still pre-scripting tests and then executing. They're still working largely from explicit documented requirements. It's just that maybe those requirements are better than they were before. Their testing is now done in shorter sprints or cycles rather than big, long projects and phases, but the actual the practice of how they're doing that testing hasn't shifted a great deal. And I guess I'm confused by these people. With all of the revolution and change and innovation happening around you, I don't get how you can think, cool, let's just keep doing what we were doing before. Especially since, like, there's a problem with this, which is that the old methods are kind of being outpaced in an Agile world. The pace of delivery, the pace of development, the pace of how we do stuff in Agile is much faster than it used to be in that kind of traditional waterfall world. And so if you're trying to do this kind of testing where you're sort of scripting stuff and then testing it, you're going to be left behind a little bit. And that's why there's a camp, because Camp 2 recognized that they were going to struggle to keep up. And they responded to that, which is good. They kind of looked at their new Agile surroundings and thought, holy crap, we need to go a bit faster. We're going to get left behind here. And since they found that they were often iterating on the same sort of feature, updating it sprint to sprint, and they'd often be repeating some of the tests that they did sort of last time or recently, they'd thought, cool, we can just do what we did again, and we can do that really easily and quickly by automating it, which is a good idea. Instead of manually testing stuff every sprint, they automate it as they go, and then next time around they just push a button and it happens for them. It happens rapidly, it happens quickly, with little effort, and they move faster. They're not being left behind so much. it's definitely faster than those Camp 1 people. It aligns nicely with some of the other stuff that's happening in kind of agile delivery teams, kind of your continuous delivery pipelines and that sort of stuff. You can mesh it in with that nicely. But it still hasn't really fundamentally changed anything either. All it's really achieved is to change the method, I guess, by which those same tests are being performed. You're still kind of pre-writing your tests and then executing them later. They're still the same tests, it's just kind of a bit faster. So I think that, as I said, nothing much has changed. The process, the practice of how people think about what I'm going to test and how I'm going to do it, it's a little bit different, using different tools, it's happening a bit quicker, but you're still fundamentally kind of committing to something at some point and then testing it down the line a little bit and kind of relying that that's still going to be useful and valuable to you. And if anything, actually attempting to automate all of the testing that you're doing is less agile than it was before, because automation is literally the practice of encoding your current knowledge, your current understanding, or your current expectations that you have about the product, about the feature, about the world, and assuming that it's going to reveal problems or useful information for you at a different time in the future. And while the intent, I guess, always is to revisit those tests and maintain them and update them and keep them present and relevant, it's amazing how quickly we do reify the truth of the passing automated test. That becomes the official word in sort of very quickly. And I think this kind of belies, I guess, the whole agile idea that we need to be more responsive to change. And I think it's kind of indicative of a common misconception about agile. This assumption that agile is all about delivering as quickly as possible. Because to my mind, that's not actually true. I think, of course, you want to optimize your delivery cadence. You want to be delivering stuff rapidly. But the most important thing is about being able to rapidly adapt to changing demands, changing situations, changing pressures. Because I guess there's no point having the fastest delivery team in the West if the thing that you're building really, really quickly isn't doing a good job, isn't delivering value to your customers, isn't going to kind of help your business succeed. And I think that typically we kind of get delivery or rapid delivery kind of as a byproduct if we can organize ourselves in this way when we're able to adapt rapidly to change. And I think that trap is the trap that testing has actually fallen into in the agile world, especially when we talk about sort of agile testing with a big A and a big T. I think that testing kind of saw agile as a threat because we couldn't keep up necessarily with this more rapid sort of world that we'd entered, and we kind of responded accordingly. We kind of responded defensively rather than seeing it as an opportunity. Recognizing that we couldn't necessarily keep pace in a new world, we kind of made the mistake of thinking that all we needed to do was get faster, do the same things that we were doing before, but faster. And so we kind of missed this opportunity that I think existed and still exists to reanalyze the new environment that we operate in and to adapt actually perform testing and to make, I guess, the way that we do testing better. So to my mind, most people who are doing testing in Agile, and especially people who are trying to automate all of their testing, they're not really doing Agile testing. They're just doing waterfall testing faster, surrounded by people doing Agile development, maybe. So let's talk about what we can do to really make testing more agile, which is to say, how can we make testing better and, I guess, better able to quickly adapt to change as a practice? I guess we're better able to help our delivery teams to be able to quickly adapt to change. In other words, how can we take this opportunity that Agile has given us sort of by using Agile thinking to make testing better and not just faster? That's certainly what we're trying to do at TradeMe. And we've developed our own sort of custom testing strategy to try and achieve this. And I think the fundamental thing about this is that when we're thinking about testing in Agile, it's a different paradigm than it was before. The old ways of doing testing were developed in a world where we kind of got one shot at the thing. We were working in big waterfall, long projects. You pretty much had one sort of phase of testing. You might have a remediation project afterwards. You might have a fixing phase, all of this kind of stuff. But really and truly, once you were done and it was shipped, it was out there, and you weren't really able to change it or update it in a very quick or easy way. And so testing was sensibly quite risk averse. We had to try and catch all the bugs. We had to try and test all the things. We knew, of course, that we couldn't do exhaustive testing. We could damn well try. We could give it a good go. Agile is different. We get a few goes. Generally, we're building smaller increments of the product. We're releasing it to smaller groups of users or more carefully, or we're experimenting with it. We're doing smarter things. We're testing as we go. We're experimenting on our users. And so we also have a greater ability to kind of adapt and react to problems or respond to things. And this should, I think, change the way that we do testing, the way that we think about testing. Because our development practices are now more agile, and our technologies are sometimes more agile as well. Maybe we have feature toggles, maybe we have A/B tests, maybe we have kind of flexible deployment pipelines. We're enabled to be more agile in how we do testing as well. And so I think fundamentally when we're testing in this world, it just doesn't make sense to try and test all of the things anymore. It's better for us to test smarter and to try and maximize the value of what we're doing, but not to go overboard. And when it comes down to it, I've kind of tried to chunk out this kind of agile testing strategy that I'm going to talk about into 3 main pillars. The first of those is encoding checks against the software using automation. Exploring the product to learn about it, to discover new things. And the third is experimenting with the solutions that you develop for your users. And we're going to delve deeper into each of these now. Encoding checks via automation is very much kind of the first pillar of a truly agile testing strategy. And I call it encoding partly because it alliterates nicely with exploring and experimenting, but also because we shouldn't forget that this is what we're doing. We should kind of remember that automation is this practice of encoding our expectations, of taking something dynamic and making it static for at least a period of time. So automation is always this practice of encoding expectations or knowledge or a current state of thinking. But automation is absolutely crucial too. Despite kind of what I've said so far, it's absolutely essential to an effective agile testing strategy. Where we have clear and explicit criteria for how the product how the product should behave or what the product should do, then encoding checks for that behavior and encoding checks for those features is absolutely essential. These will deliver the speed benefits that we talked about by saving time, again, from having testers manually go and check that stuff. But that's not the main benefit. The main benefit really is that machines are just better at doing this kind of checking, this kind of testing, than human testers are. I don't know if you've ever tried to put together IKEA furniture or something that has a complicated set of instructions, but you probably failed the first time around. I know I can't do that. As humans, we're pretty bad at following instructions. We're pretty bad at following set procedures and things like that. We're more likely to sort of have our own ideas and interpret them in different ways or do other stuff at the same time. And that leads us to not really do a good job of that sort of a thing. Machines, though, they're really good at this. They're going to do precisely what we tell them to do, and they're always going to do precisely what we tell them to do. So they do a better job of checking, which is cool, and it also then means that we free up our humans to do a better job of whatever it is that humans do well, which we're going to talk about shortly. But I think the key thing with automation in an agile world is to not go overboard with this. Where a traditional sort of agile testing, big A, big T agile testing falls down, in my opinion, is that It's that attempt to automate all of your testing. And this is flawed partly because I think it assumes that you can automate all of testing, which I don't think that you can. We're going to talk about exploring and experimenting shortly, and I don't think you can automate that. But it's also flawed because if you try and automate everything, you're going to end up with a giant sort of wieldy behemoth test suite. You're going to try and replace all of your sort of really tricky, fiddly edge cases with automation that's doing really complicated stuff, and it's going to flake out every now and again, and it's just not super reliable. It's really hard to kind of build all of the tests in a big way and run them regularly and reliably and have them really be genuinely solid and robust. As soon as you have a big suite of tests that fail occasionally, you kind of lose the value of a big suite of tests anyway, because if something's failing sort of often or regularly or occasionally even, a tester will look at it and go, oh, a real failure. Maybe that doesn't really matter. Environmental thing. Maybe that test's just flaking out. Maybe it's Wednesday and this test never passes on Wednesdays or something like that. And that's kind of a problem because you're kind of doing this checking because you have... Sorry, we're going to swap this out. Yeah, cool. All good.
Is that working?
Yeah.
Sweet. Where was I? Cool. So I think ultimately it's really easy to fall into this trap of building too much automation. And that really is essentially the same thing as building technical debt into your product. Remember that, or I guess I always like to think of test code, automation code as being part of the product. And if you're building stuff that doesn't work reliably, that fails sometimes, then it's just as bad as having a product that doesn't work reliably and that fails sometimes. And so instead of trying to go really hard out and automate all the things, I think that we should try and be lean with how we do automation in an agile world. I think that we should focus on automating kind of the really core, crucial, business critical scenarios. Your really central business logic. The stuff that if it fails, it's going to cause you major issues, and you're going to want to know about it immediately, and you want to build this in such a way that as soon as it does fail, you know precisely why it's failed. Build it so it has good error logging, good error messages, that you know if it's this kind of failure, what's wrong, and you can fix it or deal with it very quickly. We still care about all of the other stuff, all of those other tests that maybe we used to automate or we tried to automate in the past, but we can find those things, we can do that testing in different ways through exploring and experimenting, which we're going to talk about. And all too often with automation and testing, I see people leave it till last. And when I say last, I kind of mean last in the testing process, last in the testing cycle, last in the activities that testers perform in an agile context. So they'll test the stuff that they're working on in their sprint, they'll pick it up, they'll manually test it, they'll do their work, they'll kind of get to the point where they're pretty happy with it, with how it works, and then you think, cool, now that I understand it well enough, I'm going to build my automation. And that's okay. I mean, it does a job because you get value from it in future sprints. It acts as a regression kind of a thing. You know that you can run that in the future and check that the state then is still the state then. But it's not really ideal because when we think about what automation is, it's about expectation. It's about checking the things that we think we know about the product. And hopefully when we're starting to build something, we have some expectations about what that thing is going to be, what that feature is going to do, how that product is going to work. And so we should probably start thinking about that and knowing that and maybe trying to build our checks for that first, or at least to define what they're going to be. I think that way we can start to get value from our automation sooner in our sprint, but we can also then sanity check that these automation checks, they're going to do the job that we want them to do. If we're actually building them early in our sprint and then we use them when the developer's making changes to the code, we're actually testing the tests. We kind of get into that sort of watchman who watches the watchman situation of let's build our test straight away and remember that it's part of the product and use it as we're testing the product test out whether the test tests the product in a nice way. It gets a bit meta, but it's really useful. So I very much encourage you to get your developers involved in defining and helping to build your automation. Get your BAs involved as well. Anyone who's in the squad, any stakeholders, what are they thinking? What are the clear, specific things that they want this thing to do? How should it work? And do that as soon as you possibly can in the sprint, when you're planning your stories, when you're sizing stuff up, when you're thinking about these things. And if you can get your developer to kind of have that done before they even cut any code, or to even build those checks before you cut code and kind of go the test-driven development kind of a way, then you're going to end up, hopefully, with better, more aligned code to actually then manually test or to do more stuff with, because you've aligned your expectations earlier, and you're going to have a more robust set of checks, because as you then run them and deploy them through the sprint, you kind of see if they're doing what you want them to do, and you fix them up to make sure that they do run on those cases if you need them to run on those things. So, for me, I think the key thing for a good agile testing strategy is to use automation sensibly. It's not a silver bullet that's going to replace testing. You're not going to be able to sort of think, cool, we never need to do any manual testing ever again. Regardless of how whiz-bang and amazing your automated deployment pipeline is, there's always going to be stuff which you're going to need humans to do. We're going to come to that. But if you think rationally about what automation is and the value that it can provide, then it will be invaluable to how you do testing in your agile team. The second pillar of our agile testing strategy is exploratory style testing. And this is a style of testing where test-related learning, design, analysis, performance happens in parallel and continuously. In other words, it's testing where you're not looking for specific things or certain problems, you're not checking for stuff. You're looking to discover. You're looking to find out new things about the thing that you're building and how it operates and how it behaves. And I think that in traditional agile testing approaches where we are trying to automate all of this stuff, this is the style of testing that gets neglected most, sometimes altogether, because you can't automate this stuff. It's a learning process. You have to be able to interact and observe and react to that. And until we can build sort of learning or conscious AI that Jeff talked about this morning, Ken talked about this morning, then we're not going to be able to have machines do this for us. And maybe if we do that, we'll have bigger problems anyway. So this is kind of the key reason for me why an automation-only strategy isn't effective in an agile world, because you're dealing entirely with expectation or explicit knowledge with automation. You can't predict everything. It doesn't fit, I guess, with the acknowledgement that we've made with Agile that we can't rely on things staying the same. This whole Agile movement is kind of predicated on this idea that the world changes, stuff happens, we can't predict it, and we have to be able to adapt to that. And automation doesn't fit with that very well. Whereas exploratory style testing is, for my money, the most agile because it allows us to do that. It's kind of the point of it, is that at any point, an exploratory tester can make a judgment based on what they're seeing, what they're doing, the product as they see it, and find it right in front of them, and decide what's the next most valuable thing to do. Instead of committing to plans and scripts and expectations, a skilled exploratory tester can continually reevaluate what they're doing and what they should do next. And so, in the same way as sort of good agile organizations can continually deliver the next most valuable increment of their product, the skilled explorer can continually test the next most valuable thing in their product. And when we do this right, I think that like the nimble exploratory tester delivers a whole different stream of value to what automated checking can deliver. Again, automation is about this expectation, about confirmatory style information, but it doesn't tell us anything new. It doesn't reveal the hidden secrets of the product to us. It just confirms or denies. Exploratory testing, I guess, offers us the opportunity to diversify the knowledge that we gather about the product, to discover new things, to discover different angles, to think about the stuff that maybe we haven't thought about yet, the questions that nobody has currently asked in the process to this point. And And so it means that if we can do this well, we're more likely to have a better, well-rounded understanding of the thing before we ship it. And it can help us to shape either during the current sprint or in the next sprint what we should do next maybe. We're kind of throwing more light into the dark corners, and it can help our design choices, our product choices, the direction that we take this thing. And generally, I guess having more information is better than having less information. And if we look at exploratory testing as providing different information than checking, then it's probably a good thing to do. And the key thing with this is that we need humans to do this. We can't automate exploratory testing. And this is why these strategy elements have to fit together, this encoding and this exploring, they have to go together, because if your human testers are busy checking stuff manually, they're not going to have time to explore very much. There's also, I guess, potentially this perception that testing can be slow. This was that sort of idea that was started with, was that we're going to be left behind in an agile world, so we have to make it faster. And that's partially true, but I think that skilled exploratory testers can move rapidly. If you're using tools cunningly, if you're developing technical skills that can help you mock data or write scripts or do things that can speed up your workflow, if you're using kind of smart heuristic-based testing, if you're structuring your approach well, if you're communicating and sort of maybe pairing of developers or VAs or other people who know the product well, you can very rapidly explore a product in a very effective and structured way. And for me, I think that upskilling testers in agile teams in raw exploratory testing skills is probably the best investment that you can make to build a better agile testing practice. And I think it's also worth remembering that humanity is an important perspective when we're testing stuff. Your users are probably human, most of them, I would say. And so you want to catch human problems. And exploratory testing allows us to think about a whole range of different quality criteria. You can empower your testers to think about accessibility problems, about the usability of the product. You can train them up to recognize these problems, recognize opportunities in these spaces, and kind of build that in early to, as soon as you start to engage with a thing that's been built, you can find all kinds of different problems, whichever ones matter most to you. So, in order to really provide value in an agile world, I think we have to embrace exploratory style testing. We have to adapt our practices to the scenario that we find ourselves in and continually question whether what we're doing is the best thing that we can be doing to help us understand and know our product really well. We should remember that discovery adds a different value stream than checking, and that can be an invaluable one in an agile world. And none of this is possible without really skilled human testers, and I think that's something that we're maybe losing by over-focusing on the technical ability to create automated checks. We're neglecting somewhat this exploratory testing mindset, this critical questioning curiosity that really good skilled explorers have. And I think we need to balance that out a little bit and not neglect that too much. And so the final pillar of our agile testing strategy is experimentation. And this fits very obviously with kind of the agile mindset of deploying stuff regularly and inspecting it and adapting it to decide on where we're going next. To the point that it might seem that this isn't really a testing thing. But I think that as testers we have to recognize that this key component of agile delivery and agile practices allows us to adapt how we do our testing. It should influence and change the way that we think about testing and the way that we do it. And I think the major change when we kind of emphasize and embrace experimentation in how we deliver stuff is that what we're testing for changes. It means that we're less likely to have to test until something is good enough to be used by most people. Instead, we're now testing until something is good enough to return useful data in our experiment. And those can be two quite different things. It may significantly change the way that we approach our testing. And it may mean that we spend less time trying to test every single function, every single edge case, every single tiny detail, because maybe we're okay letting our users tell us some of those things, tell us how these things work in particular situations. Maybe we're going to control the users that we deploy this to initially, that we serve this experiment to, and so we don't need to test all of it straight away. And instead, we might have to devote some more time to the controls that ensure this experimental feature is deployed to the right people and only the right people. We maybe need to test our monitoring systems that are going to help us interpret the results of this experimentation. Like, what's the data that's coming back? How are we interpreting it? Is it a true reflection of what's going on and what our people are doing? And so in this way, testing can both narrow in scope in that we might accept a bit more risk and allow the experiment to kind of do some of our testing for us, but it also broadens in scope because we have to consider that we have more control systems in place, we have more technology to allow us to do this experimentation, and we need to make sure that's going to work effectively for us too. And this experimentation mindset is only going to work if you're happy to embrace some extra risk. There's no point investing heaps of time and effort in creating perfect experiments. And so as testers, we're going to need to get better at judging how little testing we can get away with doing. What's just enough testing to do? This is kind of a core thing that we think about at TradeMe a lot. This is generally what's going to allow you to move more rapidly as a development team too. If we're doing just enough testing, it means we're not always taking that extra couple of hours to really fine-tune this thing. We can push stuff out more quickly, and we can kind of generate data and more useful information more quickly. But it also means we need to have confidence in the systems that allow us to do this. Do we have feature toggles that we can quickly turn off if something goes horribly wrong and deploy to production? Can we turn them on quickly? Will they automatically switch off? Have we got sort of a scaled rollout system that's driven by some of that monitoring as well? Can we roll back code changes quickly and effectively? Do you know how that's going to work? Do you know if you've got database changes that are going to have screwed up a bunch of data? Can you clean it up very quickly? Have you tested that stuff? These are, I guess, things that we have to start to think about in this experimental world that changes a little bit now. They're new considerations, and we have to be more aware, I guess, of these different kinds of risks. These aren't just functional feature risks, they're kind of deployment risks and things that we have to consider now. But they're things that testers can help us to discover and help us to think about and make sure that we're not just building quality software for our users, we're building quality mechanisms for delivering that stuff and testing it and experimenting with it and learning about it. And as testers, I think we're used to observing the outcomes of changes that we make directly with the system. What we do as testers traditionally is we do stuff to a system and then we watch to see what happens. And when we shift to this experimental mindset, a little bit of that changes because sometimes we're going to be watching other people interact with the system, but we still want to see what happens. We still want to make sure that we're interpreting the consequences of those actions and learning from them in the way that we're used to doing. And so as testers, we're well placed, I think, to help decide what are we going to look for? What are these observations that we're going to make? How are we going to learn about the success or the failure of this feature? So we can work with our teams to ask those questions, to understand what information we need to look for. And I think that we can kind of invest as well in becoming better at monitoring, understanding data, the analytics side of things, to help us to do this. I'm going to have to rush through this last bit a little bit. Sorry. So the key thing with experimentation is that it's this foundation stone of Agile, but it can and it should change the way that we test as well. In other words, Agile allows us to experiment more with our products and with our features, and we should test differently as a result of that. It means that we can embrace risk kind of more because we have the ability to get more valid data from our users, but it also means that we're able to revert those changes if we need to learn from them. And it means that we have to watch very carefully when we do deploy our changes. But the really important thing with this, with those three pillars, is that they have to stand together. They're all kind of tactics within an overall strategy. And I don't think that on their own they're going to be very effective because they each simultaneously rely on and support one another. Encoding automation, for instance, it frees up human testers to do exploration. And exploration means that we don't have to automate all of the really fiddly, complicated edge cases around this. experimentation reduces the need for us to do exhaustive exploratory testing and find all of the nitty-gritty things, because our users can always that stuff. But we also have to explore sufficiently to deploy something that's good enough to generate useful experimental data. So it's a mutually dependent ecosystem of testing tactics. And as soon as you opt not to include one of those tactics in your strategy, you're introducing kind of a fragility to it and to your testing, and ultimately probably to your product. And I think that's a shame, because it's possible to do. We've been afforded an opportunity by sort of the Agile revolution that has occurred to reevaluate how we do testing. And I don't think we've necessarily taken it as well as we could. So Agile has made it easier for us to deliver software in a better way, but unless we also think carefully about how we adapt our testing to fit that better way, we'll still be delivering lower quality software than we probably could be, and that's a shame. How are we doing with time? Can we wrap it up? Okay, cool. So, I was going to talk more specifically about what we're doing at TradeMe, like day to day, because we're partway through this journey. Like that strategy of testing that I just talked to is pretty much what we're trying to get to, and I think we do a really good job on the exploring side. I think we do a pretty good job on the encoding side, and we're just kind of trying to push more into the experimentation side at the moment. So if you're interested to hear more about the kind of day-to-day specifics of stuff, then please come and find me around the conference over the next day or two. I'll just flip through some slides so you can see some pictures at least. So yeah, TradeMe, it's a pretty unique environment. We deploy a bunch of times. Like, we tend to make over 100 changes to our sites every week. We kind of run Spotify-inspired Agile squads. Our testers do all of the testing, so we very specifically hire people who can do all three of those things. The encoding, the exploring, the experimenting makes it quite difficult, and it kind of goes against the idea of having test engineers and test analysts. I like for our testers to be the full package of testers, and I think that's the truly agile tester, is the person who can adapt their approaches and do what they need to in any situation. We do that. We do some automation, mostly in the API, some on the front end as well, especially on the responsive version of the website. We do a bunch of exploring. I think our core practice at TradeMe is exploratory testing. We're really good at that. And we're moving more so into experimentation. And so to wrap up, hopefully this is where we've almost got to, is that for me, testing with agility can't be automated. We can't automate truly agile testing, because it requires a multi-threaded strategy. We require ways of going after different kinds of information, different kinds of value, variable skill sets, and to be able to adapt the way that we test to the different challenges as they come up and as